Alright, we're starting again February 13th, 2016. This second
Part two.
part two, exactly. We were left off with going to Fort Sam, Houston, and San Antonio, Texas as the first military assignment. Why don't we start with, you getting the orders and.
We have to start with the trip down.
Okay.
And I was the one who discovered that Fort Sam was in San Antonio because Neil and his dad were all going to Houston. But something I had read in history, in the Alamo or something, I remembered. So we did head out in the right direction in this Volkswagen Bug that wasn't too much. It was newer than the Ford, but it was an old Bug, small.
I can remember I loved it.
Yes, we did love it.
I started.
And the interstate highway system had been started, but it wasn't very far along. And Interstate 35, we had it for a while, but it petered out in Kansas or something. We had very little money, and they didn't have motels like they do now. So there we would be. I can remember being in Waco, and they had some pitiful hotels. And we looked and we looked, and we finally found these little rock cottages. Do you remember that on the Circle? That we could afford, and found a place. And when we got into San Antonio, it was a huge city. We'd never been in a city we'd visited Chicago, I guess, occasionally. But it was a huge city, and just finding Fort Sam and finding our way around the post and figuring out where you were supposed to be that first day and trying to find a place to live in San Antonio. Do you remember how we found that apartment complex?
Well, it was right across the street from Fort Sam, so I suppose here's the gate to Fort Sam and there's apartments.
But we were looking in when we looked on the other side of Fort Sam first. And if you know the west of Fort Sam, even
Broadway.
then it was a little seedy. And if you went up Broadway into Alamo Heights, it was way out of our budget. But we did come back and I guess found Belmead Apartments and had what we thought was a very nice one-bedroom apartment, close, and I could walk to the base because I may have taken you to work, but you usually had the car.
And I was still anxious about not being late, so I think I reported in a day or two before I actually had to, but I signed in and adjutant or somebody said, well, take a couple of days, get back, and be back here next week. And actually that gave me 2 days seniority on a couple of the other lieutenants that were reporting in. And sometime during that period there was a big parade and they needed someone to lead the battalion, and it was the senior lieutenant. And they looked at the dates of rank and they said, well, Libby, you got these guys by 2 days, you're leading the parade, which was not my forte at all, but I imagine I got through
And
it.
it was like when you went to Charlottesville, there was an 8-week course, an officer training course. And we still didn't really understand what you were going to do when that course was over. And there were some other pharmacists and other ROTC people from the University of Wisconsin in that class. Do you remember that?
What did
And
you do?
they were all there for the 8 weeks, and then they were shipped out various places.
What did you do in your basic training?
It wasn't really basic, it was an officer course, no real physical training. I'd been not real interested in ROTC, was not in very good shape. Did fine academically. I think I scored high academically in the officer course, but it was how to wear a uniform and
Oh, and you had doctors and dentists and vets in the course.
Yeah, it was pretty low key. Then I walked to the other end of the post, to the medical training center, and it was basically an AIT training. That was advanced individual training, where they would take the kids who were coming out of basic training, and their first higher level training would be as a medic, maybe a 91 Alpha, I think. But basically, you know, when the movies say medic, medic, these are the guys that run over. So I was platoon leader, Company C, 3rd Battalion, and it was a very interesting year in that I was solely unprepared for troop duty, but sort of got into it, had the uniforms eventually tailored, you know, fatigues that were tailored, had my field jacket tailored, wore black leather gloves.
And got in shape. There was a lot of physical training.
Quite a bit, although it was still not in the degree of shape. And I learned quickly that if you had to march the troops someplace or grab some corporal, was say, take the troops there and I'll observe you. So they marched the troops there. But it was troop inspections, it was barracks inspections, no class work. There was a training division where the classes were given on CPR and bandaging, but that was handled by the nursing service division. That was strictly troop duty. Mm-hmm. But I found out the difference between a master sergeant, a first sergeant, and a buck sergeant, what the role of a sergeant major was.
And you'd have guard duty.
Had guard duty.
Didn't you at night?
Officer of the guard, sure. Where, you know, we didn't have a race riot, but we had close, and it was a racially sensitive time, and we had some of the black troops would head to the mess hall, and 4 or 5 of them would get in the front of the line, and their buddies would come over and get in front. We had one officer said, all right, all you black boys get to the back line, white troops going to eat first. He was actually relieved.
Good.
At that time, we were going to have a promotion party for one of the guys that made first lieutenant. We went to the TP Steakhouse in San Antonio to set up the party.
On Austin Highway.
Austin
I remember
Highway.
it well.
Guys, good steaks. Guys said, we'd be glad to have you, but no blacks.
That was what year?
That would be 63, 64. You know. Whitney D. Semino, remember, he wasn't a pharmacist, but he was in one of the companies from Appaloosa, Louisiana, I think.
Yes, way back in the bayous.
And, you know, and good officer, nice guy, but geez, I can remember very, very racist, you know.
A white officer
Yeah.
was?
Yeah, white officer.
And there were also black officers? Or not?
A few ROTC primarily, you know, college.
Wasn't there a story, and it might have been later, and we can talk about it an hour later, where you were going to lunch one time, and they refused to serve a black officer that was with you, and you all obviously went someplace else. Do you remember that, or?
Of course, you know, I don't think I'd ever spoken to a black person until I got to college, and I don't really remember any blacks in the pharmacy class, and there were only, I think there were 97 people in my class, pharmacy class. I think there were 3 women, so the whole demographics of growing up, we didn't know really anything in minorities, and too dumb to be prejudiced, I guess, or didn't.
But I don't remember the lunch, but I do remember planning the promotion party at the TP Steakhouse and not doing it because they wouldn't take any black people. But military justice was different also. One of the really interesting things you did was serve on 2 or 3 cases.
Were you a lawyer, an acting lawyer, or?
You know, basically.
I don't remember the details. You'll have to.
That's very true. Basically, at that level, there weren't enough attorneys, so any commissioned officer could serve as a defense counsel. And I can remember there were 3 women soldiers were going to be released from active duty because they were allegedly lesbians. And it was my job to defend them. And I really got into it, and battalion commander said that's probably the best defense I've seen in a long, long time. They got general discharges. They didn't get dishonorable or honorable, general discharges. But I think that was, there was just that was a good, and you know, I shot on the 22 pistol rifle team, or pistol team, was just a good indoctrination for an officer for my later military career, and found out that there was a pharmacy consultant in Washington who handled assignments, and I put in a letter to him. First, I can remember I requested a secondary MOS of 4490 medical supply officer based on my pharmacy training, and was awarded that without any schooling, and then wrote the pharmacist in Washington, said I'd like a pharmacy job, and I would be willing to extend beyond my 2-year commitment if we could have that. And after 14 months, come down on orders for the Ryukyu Islands, which was about like Houston, Texas.
We had
I want
no
to hear.
idea.
I want to hear about Okinawa, but before, tell me what it was like being a military wife and where you were working, and when was Chris born?
She was, we got
we moved
to
on post too.
Yes, we did. We left the apartment because it was cheaper.
Hardy Street, or
Yes, Hardy Street. Those houses are gone. They
Yeah.
were weary housing. But anyway, I did some substitute teaching. But it was different, and I had a long-term substitute job at Incarnate Word High School, where I took over after some woman had surgery. So I taught for most of not quite a semester, but quite a long period of time. But with one car, it was always a juggling act. But I did enjoy that. But you did have a role as a military wife, and you were expected, you know, to follow along and do the military wife thing. And actually, in that era, it was good, because you go into this community where I knew nobody, and if the women aren't working, you're not making friends. So it was kind of a core of people that you had something in common with, and you did things together, and they had lunches and did good deeds, where you worked at the thrift shop and raised money for charity. And
I can remember with Chris, one of my comments was, "My God, this baby's more fun than a new gun."
and she was born just about a year after we came into the military at Brooke.
$222 a month as a second lieutenant. I remember that.
Yeah, plus what they called subsistence and housing,
Which
was very little.
And so when Chris was born, you moved back on base, or you were already on base?
We were already on base. You know, there was always, every place we went, there was a wait for quarters. And when our name came up, we took it.
And I transferred my pharmacy license to Texas and got a job working weekends and some nights at Royal Pharmacy.
Was that our first trip?
Yeah, I think so.
I can remember driving to Austin.
Yeah.
You had to take the legal test?
Yep, had to take the legal test. So there was, I think it was that first tour. I'm sure it was.
Okay.
So had some extra money coming in.
And then you got orders to Okinawa.
The Ryukyu Islands.
Before that, I want to hear, there was a story about Grandma Libby coming to Texas to see Chris as a baby.
Chris was actually 2.
Was that on the way back?
That was after our Okinawa
Okay,
tour.
well, we'll get to that.
But there is that, you know, we didn't realize how upset
Didn't even
our
cross the line.
parents were when we left.
You know, took the baby, took off.
Well, even going to Fort Sam Houston, my parents, nobody had moved further away than Oshkosh among my mother or my father's family. Everybody was close. And we were just blithely packed up and left.
See ya.
So that first Christmas, when we were still in the apartments, my mom and dad and Ding came down for Christmas. You remember that? Ding had the 2 weeks vacation, and they came down and spent Christmas with us
In Texas.
in Texas. And they, you know, my dad loved it. He came to Texas every chance he could get because it was warm and
Any golf.
yeah.
Love to golf.
But anyway, so Chris was born about 6 weeks. Our orders, you left. She was born in October 26th,
1964.
I flew back to Wisconsin. No, we flew back to Wisconsin together about the 1st of December, I think. And then you went to Okinawa. Did you didn't drive the car there, did you? No.
The car.
The car.
The car. We had bought our first new car, 1965 Mustang Coupe, Prairie Bronze, 3-speed on the floor with a 289 horsepower, triple carbs on it. I can remember driving back to Wisconsin and stopping someplace, and a couple of guys sitting out in front of the store said, "What kind of car is that? Must be one of those foreign jobs." You know. But then we got orders for, and we had this car. And what was the speed limit we found out? 30 miles?
30 miles per hour on the island of Okinawa,
So
plus the salt air.
we swapped it back for a Volkswagen and enough cash, I guess, to pay it off.
Did you drive that to San Francisco?
I drove the Volkswagen
by yourself
myself to San Francisco.
because we didn't have housing, and they wouldn't
You drove
let.
the Volkswagen to San Francisco from
To-
Texas.
From Texas.
So I guess
No air
I flew back.
conditioning, of course. And you see, they would ship a car for you if you had agreed for an accompanied tour. I can't remember exactly. I think an unaccompanied tour was 13, 15 months. An accompanied tour was
2.5 years.
2.5,
30 months.
30 months. But we signed up for the accompanied tour. They shipped the Volkswagen. Ruthie and the babe went home, and at that time you stayed with
I
your
did
folks.
stay with my parents.
Stayed with your folks. I lived in a BOQ off of, on base. Eventually the Volkswagen got there, so I had transportation. Was chief pharmacist, and at that time about a 250 bed hospital, pretty sleepy, but Vietnam was just warming up. We were starting to pour troops into Vietnam. 173rd Airborne come in. They marshaled up on the island, and that whole unit brigade shipped out. We expanded to 500 beds, and I was the youngest department head because I was chief pharmacist. I made first lieutenant.
What was the mission of the hospital?
It was basically you had general hospitals and post hospitals, and it was basically a 200-bed full-service hospital with OB/GYN, pediatrics, surgery, outpatient services, radiology, pharmacy.
There was a huge military presence on Okinawa in the 60s. A huge Marine base.
Yep. Air base.
Huge, two big at
Kadena
least,
and
and Naha
Naha,
Air
too.
Force bases. There were a lot of, and we lived next door to an intelligence officer. because of China. They were there was surveillance or something going on in China, and a lot of army troops. So,
And I can remember the point, the incident, that I decided that a military career might be an option. And I don't know if you even remember this. I got there, had Sergeant Lou Gonzalez, who good solid NCO, had probably gone through a dozen lieutenants as chief pharmacist. So he was supportive, you know, didn't run the pharmacy, gave me decisions to make. But when I got there, the pharmacy was very antiquated. Every ward had a pharmacy on it. We ran the pharmacy Monday through Friday, 8 to 12, 1 to 5. That was it. And of course, when you send all kinds of meds to the units, I think the loss rate was 25% went home, you know, just all kinds of problems. And the outpatient pharmacy was open 8 to 12, 1 to 5. So if you were a mother with a sick kid and a prescription, you got there at 5 minutes after 12, you waited till we opened up at 1 o'clock. Or if you got there at 5 minutes after 5, you went to the emergency room, waited, got a few pills, and had to come back to the pharmacy. And I'd been there about a month, and I said, this just isn't the way it should be. So I talked to the chief professional services, called Lou Gonzalez in, and I said, Sergeant Gonzalez, we're going to be open to 6 o'clock at night to cover the clinics, and we're going to be open over the noon hour. You take one shift from 11:30 to 12:30, and I'll take one from 12:30 to 1:30. And we'll go cuts. And the only reason they wanted to go at 12 was so guys could eat together. And he looked at me, and he said, yes, sir. And at that point, I sort of figured out I can do some things better in this business than's been done before.
That's a good
And
story.
we did it. And of course, everybody loved it. Given services to the nurses, put a sign in the waiting room, accuracy our profession, courtesy our policy. And, you know, there was still that undercurrent of, well, it's free, so we don't have to give good service, you know. And that was not the way I ran the show.
When did you show up?
in either the end of March or the 1st of April. It took a long time to get housing. And that was another trauma, taking the 4 or 5 month old baby on this long trip. And for some reason, I had way too much luggage. I don't know if we hadn't shipped it separately. I don't know what happened. But anyway, I had way too many suitcases and Kristen. But somehow flew from Madison into Chicago, Chicago into San Francisco. I had to get transportation to Travis Air Force Base.
By yourself?
Yeah, by myself, which I hadn't done ahead of time because, you didn't have a computer. You couldn't look stuff up. And Chris and I had gotten all these shots at Truax Air Force Base in Madison. You must have gotten all yours, and maybe I couldn't because I was pregnant in San Antonio. But anyway, they neglected to give me one of the shots that was required. So I got to Travis Air Force Base. I don't think it was yellow fever, but it was something. And I was sick as a dog from that shot.
With the baby.
With the baby. And no place to get bottled milk. It was a little bit of a nightmare because there was very little help.
And even then, the wait for government housing was like 12 or 14 months. So I had a Korean in the pharmacy who had been there for years. And he had connections in the community. So I got a statement of off-base housing that had been inspected by the military to be acceptable.
Which you had to, they wouldn't let you stay just any place. It had
No.
to be approved housing.
And got that. And then 6, 7 months, how long were you with your folks?
About 5.
About 5 months, so that cut the time well in half. But when you come in, we were off post.
In an Okinawan neighborhood.
In an Okinawan
And
neighborhood.
they still had open sewers in Okinawa. People burned their garbage. There wasn't, and this was a little village, a tiny Japanese.
And there was
Although
not
they
a
were-
lot of space because it's an island.
It's an island, and it wasn't it wasn't houses like we saw in Japan. They were concrete block, weren't
Yeah,
they?
they're cement block.
Because of they called them
Typhoons.
typhoons, because of the hurricanes. But it was like stepping back into maybe the early of 20th century or the late 19th century.
And
But
then-
we loved it. It was
Yeah,
an
we were
adventure.
together, and the baby was there, and then there was a Air Force NCO who was leaving, but was gonna spend 3 more years, and had an Okinawan wife, gonna come back, so I worked some deal where I bought his house, and then we moved.
Which was a nicer house.
Yeah, it was a nicer house with a garden and a gardener. Still pretty much concrete block house, but we moved into that.
Was the water beautiful over there? Or?
Yes. Oh, it was so small. You could see the Pacific Ocean on the east and the East China Sea on the west. The water was beautiful. You had to be really careful of the beaches, and you could, because of the open sewer business.
Oh.
So they had a couple, and no wonder the Okinawans didn't like the Americans. They had a couple, of course they took what they wanted. They took the land that they wanted. They took a couple of the beaches that were clean for American servicemen.
And I swapped the Volkswagen for a Triumph Spitfire, a 2-seater
We had a
British
picture of Chris
sports car.
Okay,
And-
picture of Chris.
in the back.
No seat belts. She
No
still,
se-
for years,
Had a scar.
right there where she went over the back seat and hit the shifter.
No
Yeah.
baby seat.
Yeah, no
No,
babies.
nobody had.
Nobody
No
had
seat
babies.
belts.
And I guess I had my first taste of sort of being important. Chief pharmacist, shaking things up, doing it. Had an NCO come to the pharmacy, and Lou Gonzalez come back and said, there's an Air Force sergeant out here, and he wants more than 2 bottles of my Atlanta. He said he goes through it all of the time. I said, send him in, let me talk to him. Well, he come in, and he said, well, sir, I just, use this all the time, and 2 bottles lasts me about a week, and I don't want to keep coming back. I said, Lou, give him a goddamn case of my Atlanta, and if you need it next time, see my NCO. And he said, well, sir, I'm the ATCO, Air Transport Control NCO. So if you guys ever want to fly any place off post on a free flight, space available, you just give me a call. And that started the Okinawa travels. And we ran sort of a travel agency out of the pharmacy. So he'd call me up and he said, well, the battalion commander's wife would like to get an OB appointment, but it's going to be 6 weeks. Can you do anything for me, Lieutenant? And I'd call the OB doc who wanted to go to Hong Kong. So we can touch on it, but we went to Hong Kong, we went to the Philippines, we went to Bangkok, and on that trip we went to Cambodia, we went to Taiwan.
We went to India twice.
Went to India twice. And the big trip that Ruth wanted, that she didn't get for years, was Japan, because it was too easy.
Everybody went to Japan.
Anybody went to Japan, anybody could get a flight, but there was only, the flights to Hong Kong were tough. And
Well, the flight
Did you get to Hong Kong? I'm
India.
sorry, I missed that.
Yes.
You got to Hong Kong.
yeah, I got to Hong Kong
Went
on
to
a
Macau.
Navy flight, medevac flight, and you have to fly in and fly back. And the
But
only,
it was you've seen these troop carriers, and you sat along the side of the plane in
Yeah,
these
the canvas seat.
canvas seat sorts of thing, noisy.
But it was free. But gee, and we went to Macau, and then in Taiwan we went up country to Sun Moon Lake, and in India we got a driver in a car and went north to Dehradun, and then south to
Khajuraho.
And the second time we
We went to Jaipur, saw the elephants, saw the Taj Mahal.
Pink Castle and all of that. So and we're, I think, very involved in the community.
There was a lot of social life, which was fun.
And there was a lot of outpost travel, and the kids, if somebody went off, you watched their kids.
And we watched a couple that had 3 kids, and we took about 3 trips for their one, because we'd have their kids for a week or 2, and then they would take Chris. She probably thought it was a second family, because she was the youngest.
And again, the military experience, when the med hold commander or company commander went on leave, I would usually take over that, cover, but I knew what a first sergeant was, and that kind of thing. So it was, and at that time I applied for a regular Army commission. I had a reserve commission, and that at that time was a big deal. If you were reserve officer, you would serve your time and get out. A regular Army officer was kept on active duty as long as you made your promotions and good efficiency.
And did you make your regular Army?
I made the RA commission.
And your primary kind of activity was taking care of Chris, probably.
Well, we had a maid most of the time, maybe not full time, but I started teaching a lot of the troops. There was a draft for both officers. People were drafted. A lot of the enlisted personnel did not have a high school diploma. So all over they had Army education centers. And one of the main things they did was they wanted every GI to have a high school diploma through the GED. So I taught the high school GED. Yes, and it was, at the time, decent pay. And I remember I would teach maybe 10 weeks and then have 2 weeks off, and teach another class of 10 weeks. And I taught everything: English, math, science, and social studies. And it was a good deal. Occasionally, you'd get some pieces of work, but mostly it was all men. And mostly the guys were very glad to be in a class, an air-conditioned classroom, and not, doing whatever they would be doing. So, and it was a good group of teachers.
I might screw it up, but you had one soldier with a Filipino background, and he wrote an essay about his father was a guerrilla in World War II, and they'd capture the Japanese soldiers and make cuts in their arm and then drop lemon juice into the cuts. I don't know if you even remember.
I don't remember that.
But I just get you impressed the hell out of me. That's a great, geez, if you're going to do a thesis or a school paper, there ain't a whole lot of them going to be written along those lines. It was...
And I taught English in a middle school, volunteered, because I had a friend who was doing it. And it was interesting. The Japanese, the Okinawans were at the time the poorest of all the Japanese citizens, and they were kind of the forgotten part of the country. The classes were huge.
So when you say you taught English, you taught English...
English language.
To the Okinawans.
To some children. But huge classes, 60 kids, very well behaved, but 60 kids in a class. And of course all the wives were volunteering. That was one of the things that the officers' wives did. And the poor instructor, we drove him crazy, because here was Ruth with a Midwestern accent. And then he'd get Mary Ellen, who was from Georgia. And then he'd get Hannah, who was from the Bronx. And he just had a terrible time with all the accents. So how much help we were, I don't know.
And there really wasn't much turbulence in the local community, anti-military or independence, I think that came over the years as they moved for more, we were,
Autonomy. Neil, I
18
disagree.
was there was some, wasn't there?
There were a
Demonstrations?
lot, well, there were a lot of demonstrations, because basically what the Ryukyu Islands was a dictatorship. And they had a civilian, and I can't remember what they called him.
Military protectorate, I think.
But there was a civilian in charge, but there were generals involved. And the Okinawan people had no freedom.
Or votes.
Or votes. And they did not like the B-52s coming to Okinawa. They later bombed Vietnam, isn't that right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there were rumors that they had atomic weapons. And there were protests against that. Sort of at the end of our tour, I remember. But we used to laugh because the Okinawans would protest, and they'd have these sit-ins. But they'd do it in like 8-hour stretches. They wouldn't have somebody protesting for days at a time. They'd have a group come in from 8 to 5, and then there'd be another group from 5 to 12, and then there'd be the third group.
And then Kadena Air Force Base, Air Force, to sort of conceal the fact that B-52s were flying in, put up like a 12-foot fence. But a B-52 tail comes like 19 feet in the air. So you drive by and there's all these fins sticking out of the B-52. So, but I never felt threatened.
No, I never did either. But I know, especially in Naha, which was in the southern part of the island, there were demonstrations when we were there, and I felt, with my liberal background, they had a perfect right, because the military, they had this R&R base up in the north part of the island. That was one of the best beaches.
Oh, what was it called?
It'll come to me.
We
And
took Chris up there.
yeah, on a little trip. I mean, and there were justice issues, because the troops were sometimes a problem, and stuff was covered up or not publicized or
And
not
they
dealt
weren't
with.
subject to the civilian courts. They were military, so.
But personally, the Okinawans were wonderful, very friendly, on a one-to-one basis. I suppose it was mainly the college students who were the
And I had
protesters.
2 Korean nationals work in the pharmacy.
And another thing that you had, which made a huge difference, you had college graduates working as techs in the pharmacy. Draftees.
Yeah, that really came into.
Was that later?
Really came into Fort Carson and
Okay,
Fort Dix.
In Fort Dix,
Yeah.
okay, not as much.
Not so much.
What about your trips? Anything about any of your trips to India or Hong Kong that
It would take
stories?
days.
Yeah, they were wonderful.
And adventures. And you had to fly by the seat of your pants, because we never did a tour.
No.
I don't think we ever took a tour. We could get some books from the library to read up, so we had some idea of where we were going and what you wanted to see. But we would fly in without a hotel reservation, find a hotel, and there were some military hotels, weren't there, that
Sure.
we could stay at
Baguio in the Philippines.
in the Philippines.
Yeah.
But we'd have, the sites that we'd wanted to see, and I can remember going to Bangkok and traveling in the rickshaws to see the Golden Buddha and the temples and
did
the
things
floating
that
markets.
were just probably not real safe, but exciting. When we went to Bangkok, we caught a flight, Royal Air Cambodia, into Cambodia.
We
And
flew into Phnom Penh and then
Penh.
into Siem Reap, because that's where the temples of Angkor Wat
Visited
are.
a Vietnamese refugee camp in Cambodia, and the driver said, "It's time to go," because I'm not sure if these are, which side these Vietnamese folks are on. So we took out of there. In the Philippines, you remember, we flew down to Cebu, and then from Cebu down to Holo, and
As we stopped at Zamboanga.
which was heavily Muslim.
But Holo was one of the furthest islands in the southern Philippines. Muslim smugglers, we found out.
And had been fighting the Catholic government in Manila since 1900, since the Philippine insurrection, but met an attorney there who was,
He gave us one of those brass
Pots
pots on top of the,
it was just a real
Korean
gentleman,
chest.
showed us around town, met the chief of police, got in a hotel, Philippine troops with a 30 caliber machine gun set up in the hallway. They told us, what about
we couldn't be seen through the screens.
stay away from the windows?
So we crawled along the the hallway so that nobody would see us. And of course the Philippine military
Snipers,
was the enemy to all the Muslim folks in
Never had a
Holo.
problem any place. And in India, I can remember we were driving at night, and the vet was with me, and I said, "Well, we gotta go to the bathroom. Just pull over." And the guy, "Well, we'll be somebody pretty soon." Pull over, damn it! I just gotta pee, And we pulled. Well, hurry. Well, it turns out it was a tiger preserve.
Oh.
And the guy said, "About half my trip to see the tigers running across the road. Didn't really want you guys out there doing anything." So,
Did you see the Taj Mahal?
Yes, we did in Jaipur.
it was beautiful.
We went, no, Agra. We went to Jaipur,
Agra.
and that's where the sandstone castle was. We went to Agra, saw the Taj Mahal. From one of the docks, we heard about this driver who called himself Raj. And I think he made his living taking
No.
military people around. But he seemed to be very trustworthy,
Meet you at the airport, and
knew a lot of history, talked the whole time we were driving to Jaipur and over to Agra and back to Delhi.
That screen in the ping pong room we brought back from India on a military flight.
Yeah.
Jesus, and the table next to my leather chair, that's what the Taj Mahal looks like. The whole building.
The marble is inlaid.
Is inlaid jewelry.
And y'all brought that back
Back
too?
from-
I brought that back, and then had a Okinawan cabinet maker make the
octagonal.
What about the
Yeah.
coffee table? Where'd the coffee table come from? In the living room?
PX.
the PX.
Oh, the PX.
The PX.
The Air Force PX. which
In
was
Okinawa?
In Okinawa, and they
And-
got rosewood furniture. How they got this from China, because we weren't trading with China, but somebody traded with China, because the two end tables, the rosewood secretary, and the coffee table all came.
And we filled scripts for the Department of the Army civilians, and the PX manager got to know him, and Lieutenant, there's a load of rosewood furniture coming in from China. You might want to get over here Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock. And we got those two end tables, the coffee table, the secretary, the silver
Oh, the silver chest.
silver chest,
And they went through move after move after move.
and they're solid rosewood. They're probably from the
You're
last.
There's-
talking 45
years, yeah.
years ago.
And they looked pretty much like
Well, it's 50 years ago.
50
Because
years
Chris
ago.
is
50.
seen 15. So the travel was enlightening, and really it was one of the things I think that bonded us, because we had these really, for us, once in a lifetime
And there's just not a
experience.
lot of wives that would have put up with that kind of adventure.
Snipers and tigers.
Yeah.
And we stayed at a dock bungalow, not in southern India, but we went down towards central India to see the temples at Khajuraho. And it basically was a little hut with a couple of rooms. There was a pot in the room on the floor with 2 footprints. That was the commode.
Oh.
And would you like a chicken dinner? Yes, that would be fine. Buck, 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 chop.
We knew that they went out, killed the chicken,
But it wasn't all.
dressed it, and then,
At another, we stayed in a castle, or dating back from the Maharaja's time,
in the foothills of the Himalayas.
in the foothills of the Himalayas, and it was so cold, I think we put a rug over
They
the
had, oriental rugs on the floor, and we were so cold that we put it on the bed.
But it was fancy.
It was grand, but there was no heat.
And then we went into the dining room, and we were still a little bit of Wisconsinites because, oh yes, Raj said you'll get a wonderful supper. Well, they served the fish.
We were there with the vet,
Yeah,
Sue and Bill Sims.
they weren't any better.
No. Well, they served fish. And the guys asked for seconds. Well, it was the fish course.
then
And then there was the main
the main,
course.
then there was the
It was
beef
a real
course.
English
5,
hotel.
6 courses,
And they made, what's weird what you remember, they made us sandwiches for the next day. And we were all excited about having sandwiches for the road trip. And they were cucumber sandwiches.
cucumber sandwiches.
On white, thin sliced cucumbers with a little butter on white bread. And that was our lunch.
I guess that's the traveling really has always been a right up to the current time as always, and the trips with the boys and the grandkids in London and.
But I had never heard of Angkor Wat. But I read a National Geographic article, and they were just archaeologists were there, and they just were beginning to cut through the jungle and find them, and tourism was just starting. Cambodia was French. We stayed in basically a French hotel.
With a mix, the food was a mix of Chinese and French, so you'd have French baguettes with your Chinese dinner. It was wonderful, French wine. And it was before the Khmer Rouge and
Right.
the bombing of Cambodia and all of that.
But like you were saying, the traveling is something that has kind of, maybe not defined your relationship, but
been a theme.
something that
Yeah.
And part of it is, there are just a whole lot of women that would not have done or gone or had the adventures that we did. But I can remember
Now, are you talking about Siem Reap
well,
or the southern Philippines?
I guess it was the southern Philippines. We went out to get to the plane. It was an old DC-3. And there was army blankets on the ground.
That was in Siem Reap, Cambodia.
Siem Reap. It was Royal Air Cambodia. There were
Parts.
army blankets on the ground, and the engine was
In parts.
on the ground. There was one plane, and the part was there. So I don't think we're going to leave on time. And so
They said, come back, try again tomorrow.
yeah,
That,
and we were military, and
I was a little worried then.
But we
was I
got
going to
back.
see? Well, this was the same time. There were other tours, and there were more the next day. And now, isn't this the same place? There were a group of French tourists who wanted the same plane. And we were waiting there out in the hot sun. The plane was put back together and on the runway. And the French tourists, as soon as they got there, they all ran to the plane. So they were first in line.
and there was one of them in front of us was dropping bags on the seats. And we got in. I picked up a couple of the bags and dropped them on another seat.
So we got a seat on that plane.
But that was
Yeah, seeing that plane in parts. And that,
and getting on it.
and getting
and getting on that, yeah, later.
it was.
I want to cut us off
Yep.
here.
Yes,
It's 5:12. We gotta hit
Oh,
the road.
yes.
But that was great. We'll
Thank you.
continue. Thank you. That was awesome. That was good.
Jesus, I get thinking back. We've been at
And
this.
we've been on